For the first part of this section of the service, the time when I'm talking, I'd like us to take a moment together in meditation. Sandra's going to help lead this reading of a meditation from Howard Thurman's book, Meditations of the Heart. So I encourage you all to sort of take a minute and get comfortable. Let's maybe relax our shoulders. Maybe, if you want to, even close your eyes for a few minutes.
Breathe in deeply, pause for a moment, and release. Exhale. Breathe in again, pause, and then release. Let's do that one more time. Breathe in, pause, and release.
Keeping track of your breaths. During these turbulent times, we must remind ourselves repeatedly that life goes on. This we are apt to forget. The wisdom of life transcends our wisdoms. The purpose of life outlasts our purposes. The process of life cushions our processes.
The mass attack of disillusion and despair, distilled out of the collapse of hope, has so invaded our thoughts that what we know to be true and valid seems unreal and ephemeral. There seems to be little energy left for aught but futility. This is the great deception.
By it whole, peoples have gone down to oblivion, without the will to affirm the great and permanent strength of the clean and the commonplace. Let us not be deceived. It is just as important as ever to attend to the little graces by which the dignity of our lives is maintained and sustained.
Birds still sing. The stars continue to cast their gentle gleam over the desolation of the battlefields, and the heart is still inspired by the kind word and the gracious deed. There is no need to fear evil. There is every need to understand what it does, how it operates in the world, what it draws upon to sustain itself.
We must not shrink from the knowledge of the evilness of evil over and over. We must know that the real target of evil is not destruction of the body, the reduction to rubble of cities. The real target of evil is to corrupt the spirit of people and to give our souls the contagion of inner disintegration. When this happens, there is nothing left. The very citadel of humanity is captured and laid to waste.
Therefore, the evil in the world around us must not be allowed to move from without to within. This would be to be overcome by evil, to drink in the beauty that is within reach, to clothe one's life with simple deeds of kindness, to keep alive a sensitiveness to the movement of the Spirit of God. In the quietness of the human heart and in the workings of the human mind, this is, as always, the ultimate answer to the great deception.
Let's keep our focused breathing in silence for a moment. These past few weeks, everything I read about Howard Thurman, every podcast or video that I watched, introduced him as the mystic of the civil rights movement. The title of mystic was easily delivered by so many curators of the Howard Thurman story that I decided I had to start this talk trying to unpack what does being a mystic mean for Thurman. He was born in Florida in 1899. He was raised by his grandmother, herself a former slave. Thurman described himself as a very sensitive child who suffered from the violence of racial conflict. He continued, I found that the more I turned to prayer, or what I later recognized as meditation, the more time I spent alone in the woods or on the beach, the freer became my own spirit. Reverend Bruce Epperly offered this description of what he called Thurman's activist mysticism. Epperly wrote, Thurman was an activist mystic, a universalist who experienced God profoundly in the non-human world of flora, fauna, sky, and sea. He believed that the world is animated by a spirit within which all of us live and move and have our being. The spirit joins all creation and is the deepest reality in every person. Thurman knew the dangers of polarization and racism, having grown up in a culture where he was an outsider to the community of power where most of the life and death decisions are made. He knew he was one who must struggle daily to affirm his identity and find his place in a society whose structures often disregard his voice and value. He knew the power of poverty and racism to destroy the imaginations and dreams of children and their parents. Thurman also knew that God is present in everyone and that transformation can occur among the greatest as well as the least of these. He believed that deep down, everyone could become a mystic. I think Thurman was motivated by the desire that everyone receives the opportunity to experience through varied channels holiness and value and a kind of personal relationship with God, going beyond self-interest and kind of into kind of a whole world loyalty. The mystic in Thurman sees our common humanity, empathizes with the suffering of the oppressed, and even as he continued to oppose oppression, he held open the desire that everyone receive an opportunity to experience holiness and value. It is this commitment to the universality of opportunity for the divine that kept Thurman moving from polarization to reconciliation. And I think his tilt toward reconciliation would later become the bedrock for Thurman's adherence to nonviolence. And that became one of his essential, or that would become one of his essential offerings to the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. And those contributions were developing in 1935 when Thurman and his wife Sue became the first African-American religious leaders to meet with Mahatma Gandhi in India. Quentin Dixie and Peter Eisenstadt, recognized as Thurman scholars, wrote of the Gandhi-Thurman meeting. For Gandhi, nonviolence or ahimsa was not really an idea at all. It was, as he told the Thurman delegation repeatedly, a force, a physical reality, a metaphysical substrate that underlined and defined all reality. The deeper truth behind the debris and flux of the world, the truth beneath and beyond the seeming brutality that apparently confined both human life and the world of nature to endless cycles of gratuitous violence. It was a force that individuals could accumulate and concentrate. Gandhi had translated ahimsa for English speakers as nonviolence. And ahimsa made sense to Thurman's evolving notion of the universality of access to the divine. The spirit of nonviolence that Thurman would offer to the civil rights movement in the United States was to be further refined in 1949 with the publication of his best-known work, Jesus and the Disinherited. In this book, 70 years ago, Thurman challenged the most basic understanding of Christianity. He wrote, "Why is it that Christianity seems impotent to deal radically and therefore effectively with issues of discrimination and injustice on the basis of race, religion, and national origin? Is this impotency due to a betrayal of the genius of the religion or to a basic weakness in the religion itself?" Thurman would would provide his own set of answers. And part of that answer was that he found Jesus to be a fighter for the oppressed. And he wrote, the basic fact is that Christianity, as it was born in the mind of this Jewish teacher and thinker, appears as a technique of survival for the oppressed. That it became through the intervening years a religion of the powerful and the dominant, used sometimes as an instrument of oppression, must not tempt us into believing that it was thus in the mind and life of Jesus. In him was life, and the life was the light of people. Wherever his spirit appears, Thurman wrote, the oppressed gather fresh courage, for he announced the good news that fear, hypocrisy, and hatred, the three hounds of hell that track the trail of the disinherited, need have no dominion over them. Jesus and the disinherited was an early call for the Christian church to live more fully into the liberational intents of Jesus. In important ways, Jesus and the disinherited was a spiritual guide that accompanied the activism of the civil rights movement. It was noted by many in the stories I read that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. carried a copy of Thurman's book with him when he traveled. King considered Thurman a mentor. And the writer Walter Earl Fluker, the editor of the Thurman papers, has said that mentorship included weaving the life and thought of Jesus with the experience of Black Americans. Fluker wrote that Thurman recognized that Black Americans, just like Jesus and his fellow Jews, did not have any rights, but they could choose to ground themselves in their own inherent dignity and worth. And if one were to choose this, it would have a lot to do with how you deal with the question of what you do when your back is against the wall. Jesse Jackson wrote that Thurman helped establish the philosophical framework for how to struggle. You cannot let the oppressor break your spirit. They can break your bones, Jackson said, but not your spirit. Thurman had interpreted ahimsa, the force that Gandhi recognized individuals could accumulate and concentrate, and translated it for the African American civil rights movement, calling on and supporting activists to live up to their inherent dignity and worth, leading them to choose nonviolence, not just as a tactic, but also as a way of life that led to spiritual fulfillment. Thurman was not often seen at protests. The reports are that some people criticized him for not being on the front lines. In my reading, though, there is a part of Thurman's life that I find compelling in its practicality, in his putting himself sort of on the front line. It was called the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples. In 1943, Thurman received a letter from a professor and Presbyterian minister, Albert Fisk. Fisk was hoping Thurman could recommend a Black minister who would join Fisk in founding an interracial, intercultural, and interdenominational church. Fisk was white, and he wanted to co-lead the new congregation with a Black minister. The work would start as only a part-time ministry, and Fisk wrote, housing could be arranged at the church building once they got a building. Thurman, who is recognized as the first one to state that adage that says the most segregated hour in America is at 11 a.m. on Sunday morning, was eager to develop a congregation that broke down the barriers that had defined his life. He met with his family and ended up leaving his positions as a tenured professor and dean of the chapel at Howard University. And in 1944, the family moved from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. And he started working on the new congregation. It is worth noting for those of us UUs that the inaugural service of this congregation was held at the First Unitarian Church of San Francisco. Thurman was clearly aware that he was forming a new congregation in the middle of World War II, what he called a historic moment in world crisis created by a struggle between totalitarianism and democracy. Thurman would work at the Church for the Fellowship for 7 years. His presence as a Black minister serving people of all colors would confound nurses at hospitals when he arrived to offer pastoral care to a white congregant, or when funeral parlors asked him not to officiate funerals of his white congregants because that could give Black people who attended the impression that they could bury their families at that parlor. Thurman would write that the true genius, he wrote, the true genius of the church was revealed by what it symbolized as a beachhead in our society in terms of community and as an inspiration to the solitary individual to put his weight on the side of a society in which no person need to be afraid. In the 1940s, that was undeniably the front lines. And I think, quite honestly, it would be today as well. I wonder if the most segregated hour in America isn't still 10 a.m. on Sundays. Today, Unitarian Universalists are exploring our faith's expression as anti-racist and undoing oppressive elements in ourselves and our institutions. You've heard us mention several times the proposed adoption of the eighth principle, that where we covenant to affirm and promote journeying toward spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. Thurman will once again be of great help to a faith movement working to build a bridge between our social and spiritual lives. That's why we're fortunate that a new book featuring 25 contemporary educators, theologians, and activists sharing the impact Thurman has had on their thought and work today. The book is being released in October, and I don't think Bob Flyant is here, but I wanted to let Bob know, our librarian, that I put an advance order in for the book, and I'll keep it in the office until we can stock our library shelves again. Thurman's thought is still growing with us today. And with that thought, I'll leave you with a reading from Howard Thurman here. He wrote, "All around us, worlds are dying and new worlds are being born. All around us, life is dying and life is being born. The fruit ripens on the tree. The roots are silently at work in the darkness of the earth against the time when there shall be new leaves, fresh blossoms, green fruit. Such is the growing edge. It is the extra breath from the exhausted lung, the one more thing to try when all else has failed, the upward reach of life when weariness closes in upon all endeavor. This is the basis of hope in moments of despair, the incentive to carry on when times are out of joint and men have lost their reason, the source of confidence when worlds crash and dreams whiten into ash. The birth of a child, life's most dramatic answer to death, is the growing edge incarnate. Look well to the growing edge."